Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. Today we have a really fun analysis episode. Chris Higgins is back. And today we're going to talk about Windows 95, command line computing, who is the Microsoft of tech today, and how and why The Matrix is the perfect hacker/internet movie. When we were recording this, we promised a bunch of things that would be in the show notes, but sadly we didn't write them down, so if you check the show notes, that's what I remember of the conversation. If there are other things that I forgot, get in touch with me over email or Twitter, and I'll add them in for later people to download. Enjoy this conversation with Chris Higgins. So, this is why I'm in the office again. And there have been disasters recording in this office. Sadly,
I've heard them.
Oh yeah. The Winamp guy, Justin Frankel, was terrible. He wasn't terrible. It was the conditions were terrible.
Yeah, it was the echoing off all the glass or metal or whatever you had.
Right, and he was kind of a low talker, so then it was hard for me to adjust the levels. You know, I'm trying to gain it up so that I can hear what he's saying, and what I really needed was, you know, a mic that I pinned to his shirt or something, which I don't have, but I should probably invest in. Mm-hmm. But so the problem is that little Penny is, I don't know what, 15, 16 months old at this point. So she's totally walking, totally mobile. Mm-hmm. And even as recently as 3 months ago, you know, I could still say to Penny and her mom, I've got to record this for about an hour, go in the back room and hang out for a while. That's totally that's a non-starter now. And you've seen our apartment, like you know, I have that little office cove there, but you know, she would just be running around the house. And then unfortunately today it's sort of monsoon season here in New York City, so I couldn't say, okay, go to the park for an hour.
Right.
So not the best recording situation today, but much better than having a 1.5-year-old running, screaming up and down the hallway and you know, reverberating everywhere. So
did you pack up your mic and all your stuff and just carry it on the subway, or how did
Yeah,
that
no. Well, I have a backpack that is sort of like a modified photographer's backpack. So it has all these pockets that, you know, the mic fits in it, and it's, you know, it's cushioned and all this stuff. And then I have the Porta booth. Who is this guy? Harlan Hogan's Porta booth. So yeah, you just disassemble that, fold it up, and I put it in a bag, and yeah. I did look like a bag person on the train coming over here, but hey man, long time no talk. You've had a busy summer, it sounds like.
You would think so, or you think I dropped off the face of the earth and stopped writing or something. But yeah, it's been a really really busy time, and it's one of those things where I think in retrospect, like, I'm getting that itchy thing of I haven't released anything in 6 months or 9 months or some number like that. And all of it is pointing towards early next year, which is not soon enough for me. And I'm working on 4 documentaries right now, some of which kind of can't be talked about, and others can definitely be talked about. Mm-hmm. So I have suddenly found myself transformed from a full-time writer to a full-time documentary creator. So I'm shooting, I'm traveling, I'm interviewing people, and I'm also writing blogs all the time. And boy, yeah.
This is obviously inside between us, but are any of those projects with Adam?
Ish. The Tetris documentary has Adam involved as a producer. So he's there and stuff. And we're about to have another Tetris tournament. We're about to hit the 1 year where I thought that would be done. Like my Tetris movie would be done. Oh no, it's not. Oh no, you know. But it's getting there. And he's been very helpful in steering me through the mistakes that I was told not to make and went ahead and made. and all that kind of crap.
Well, if the listeners are not aware, competitive Tetris is actually a thing. A friend of ours, Adam Cornelius, a few years ago did a documentary on it called The Ecstasy of Order. And you guys have been involved even running in the tournaments and stuff for several years, right?
Yeah, competitive Tetris, and even in this case, specifically competitive Tetris using 25-year-old Nintendo hardware. So a very specific niche within the overall niche of competitive Tetris. But yeah, there's an annual tournament that's in Portland, Oregon, and now I'm going to be the head ref, I guess. I think I was head ref a couple years ago, and that's what led me to write my first article about it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, now the thing is, there will be 2 in-depth documentaries about this very specific and very small subculture, and I think that's great. It's just a little bit strange when you try to explain it to people. Like when I go to get a haircut, they say, "What did you work on all day?" And I'm like, "Well, competitive Tetris." And they say, "Tell me more." And I just, I go on the whole thing about, yes, they plug in the Nintendo controller and they play the Nintendo, and then they do this all the time. It's an amazing achievement that a lot of people have gotten very, very good at this game that is 30 years old, and they keep going back.
It's kind of like a platonic ideal of a game too, but you know what? We can talk about some of your other projects at the end here. But one of the things, aside from the fact that I hadn't spoken to you in so long, that prompted me to want to talk to you again was actually Portland centric. Mm-hmm. I apparently need to attend XOXO Fest at some point. It sounds like it's the new awesome festival or something.
That would be wise. Yeah, I would say that is a place to be. And I sort of lucked into it the first year. It was Andy Baio and Andy McMillan. Andy Baio is a Portland guy. Andy McMillan was, excuse me, I think he was in Northern Ireland somewhere. But he had done conferences. And they decided to make a Portland conference kind of like a festival for the arts, for independent, people who have maintained their independence and released something, whether it's music or film or code or made a company.
So like indie creators, basically.
Yeah. And it's sort of, it's ambiguous where the line is, right? Because you'll have people who have long careers and have worked for corporations and stuff. And then you'll have people who are, like Aaron McKeon of WordNick, who kind of make their own stuff and are kind of partially... Anyway, it's all kinds of different independent people. You have a lot of musicians, too, who get up there and kind of say, well, here's how I make my living, shrug, and then let it all out. Game designers who get up there and say, here's how it's working or not. And it's a combination of topics, like people who actually present, they give little 20-minute things, which end up on YouTube, so you're going to get to see all that stuff. That's the main program of the weekend, but then there's all this surrounding stuff, kind of festival-y stuff. So music events, live podcast tapings, all sorts of, not really, there's a rule against panel discussions, but there was a panel discussion this year of the suck.com people.
Right, which is what we want to talk about.
Well, unfortunately, I feel like I'm going to be ill-prepared to actually say much about that aside from what I observed, but it will be a very naive view of it, which is kind of cool.
Well, no, actually, it's what you observed that I'm curious about, because if you are a regular listener of the show, I don't know what episode it would be, but I think it was, the title was maybe Big Media's Big Web Adventure. We talked about Pathfinder and Wired and all this stuff, and in that episode, one of the big pioneering sites was suck.com, which was founded by Joey Anuff, I don't know how you say his name, and Carl Steadman, both of whom I tried to obviously get for the show to interview about Suck. It turned out that Owen Thomas was able to talk to me a lot about it because he was involved with Hotwired at the time and Suck and things like that. So apparently at XOXO Fest, both of them showed up, Joey and Carl, and the funny thing about it is that Owen had told me that at least one of them, but I got the impression both of them had kind of completely gone off the grid. I don't remember exactly his wording, but essentially he told me, yeah, good luck getting in touch with them. So it was surprising and thrilling to see that they actually did participate in this panel discussion to talk about Suck. And so I'm curious to know, did you get that impression that they were maybe a bit a bit surprised to be talking about this, a bit annoyed to be talking? Well, I'm just curious the impression about them.
Well, I got several things out of it. One thing to clarify, there were actually two panels. So one of them, like the way that this thing works, people think it's a tech conference or they think it's like South by Southwest. And I don't know. I've never been to South by Southwest, but I've been to a lot of tech conferences. So you have to understand, there was actually an event programmed during the day, like when people are typically giving kind of a how I did my thing, or here's an inspirational thought, or whatever, like a talk like that. There was a panel stuck in that programming that was not just Joey and Carl. In fact, Owen might have been on that. Do you want me to look this up right now?
No, but I will link. I will link to both of those things in the show notes because I think you found the links to like transcripts of it, or maybe even the YouTube videos up at this point or something. I don't know, but I will link to that. So check the show notes.
The video's not up yet, but I have photos of all this stuff. But anyway, there was a panel that involved them and two women whose names I forget. But it was apparently the main, nucleus of the site. And so that was on Saturday or maybe Sunday, and that was the whole group together. Mm-hmm. And that was freewheeling and kind of friendly and involved a couch and two sort of end chairs. So in that one, there was a line between whether it was all a joke or whether it was actually kind of serious. And I think it was probably both, that they all hated each other and really hadn't spoken in 15 years, but clearly they had. And so there was a lot of purposeful ambiguity about what the hell was going on with these people. Like, to what extent were they alienated from each other as a group? And it was funny and odd, and you could kind of tell the Suck.com fans in the audience because they would laugh at stuff that was a callback to the actual reality of Suck.
Right, the memes maybe that Suck was famous for at the time, and the inside jokes and stuff, yeah.
Well, and also just talking about how they worked kind of as a company. Like, we decided to make these cartoons, and so here's the one who drew all the cartoons. And they'd say, okay, remember your process for drawing the cartoons? And she'd say something like, yeah, I did X, Y, Z to draw the cartoons, and I would walk around bugging people until they would do something funny, and then I would write it down. You would just see them. It was like fun to watch people reminisce about previous careers, and also how much or how little money they had made, either at Suck or at all their subsequent things that...
Right, I believe one of the women was probably Anna Marie Cox, who more famously as Wonkette is a real blogging pioneer, but I know she was involved, and Heather Haverleski, I think maybe might have been. I know she was involved too, but anyway, so go on.
Yeah, so at that panel, which was, again, later in the weekend, because this thing starts on a Thursday and ends on a Sunday night, so this was probably on Sunday, I forget. Point is, large group of people, 5 people on stage. And the only other thing that was like this that we've seen before at an XOXO event, which was in 2013, I want to say, was when Glenn Fleischman interviewed the Boing Boing group. Jenny and Corey and all those people.
Yeah.
And it was that was, again, basically a panel of people who've been working together for a long time. Now, the thing is that they still work together, but they're kind of an autonomous set of people who happen to, some of them live in the same place and all that jazz. So, but the vibe for this one was there was no moderator. It was just kind of them moderating their own rambling reminiscence of what Suck.com was. And that was pretty entertaining and kind of more normal because there was more content to be had in having 5 people remember an event and pipe up and say, oh, right, remember when this happened? And they would say, yeah, that I remember that. Whereas several nights earlier, I think this was Friday night, there was this event, in between other podcast tapings, which was basically, I don't know if it was recorded. I don't know if it'll be on YouTube. What it was either a piece of performance art that I didn't quite understand, or it was literally... Now, I'm going to back up. Do you know... So it's Joey and Carl, right?
Right.
Do you know which one has kind of the longer, flat hair and which one kind of looks older?
No, I don't, because the only pictures that I, would have seen of them were from 1995 vintage. So
right, when they looked basically very similar and kind of they're in Wired, being awesome. Well, the point is, it starts out with them saying that they each have an obsession with over retrieving and storing data. Like stuff. Like one of them saying, I've downloaded all of the Billboard #1 singles ever. And the other one saying, well, yeah, so have I get torrents too. And the first guy saying, no. But see, I didn't just download them. Like I learned about them. And it's effectively one guy who's obsessed with over documentation telling another guy who is probably equally obsessed with some kind of acquisition. That thing of being like, I have every episode of...
Right, a completist, yeah.
Yeah. Just going through this thing and showing his slideshow to the annoyance of his former colleague. Like the whole thing was annoying the other guy and trying to tell him why it was important year by year. So it's literally like, okay, so in 2001, I became obsessed with learning everything I could about doo-wop. And then just trying to give the audience a little bit, like it would start by giving some information about doo-wop, but then it would go completely off the rails into the other guy being annoyed by the whole concept and saying, you don't know anything about doo-wop. What are you talking about? Did you actually research doo-wop? And the first guy saying, well, yeah, no, I got a book and here's a picture of the book that I learned all the stuff about why doo-wop was important and the origins of doo-wop. And, and there's this, here's a great record that we should definitely look into. And
okay,
then, yeah.
That's interesting to me because that does sound like some sort of a performance.
Right.
And wait, because I haven't been to the festival, is that something that is done? I mean, maybe it sounds like there's maybe comedy occasionally, there's podcasts recorded, but are there performance events at this?
Yeah. I mean, not usually. It's unambiguous that it's a performance because it's a podcast of people. Oh man, there was one that was really unexpected and good, and I forget the name of the podcast. But the gist is, there's a guy who falls through like a transdimensional warp hole behind a Burger King and ends up in this other universe where he has a leaky, low-quality Wi-Fi connection to the real world, and his best friends are like a badger and a wizard. And so they're standing up on stage, and there's a guy in a kind of a weasel costume and a guy in a wizard costume, and they're very clearly doing a comedy performance. Or the guys of You Look Nice Today did a podcast recording,
right.
Like a live You Look Nice Today, which was amazing.
Yeah.
So those were unambiguous, and it's very common for there to be unambiguous humor. It's also fairly common for there to be, you have to really figure out what's going on to find out whether the thing that's happening is humor. Like Darius, I think his name is Kazami, a couple years ago did a thing called How I Won the Lottery, which just Google it. Just go to the show notes right now and watch Darius talk about How I Won the Lottery, which is, I won't say anything more about it, but just a brilliant talk. But the point is, this was completely ambiguous to the point that I looked around to other people in the audience, many of whom were leaving, which is very unusual for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because you've signed up for 20 minutes or 40 minutes of something, and some people were super into it. I think they were like down in the front row. I think Christina might have been at this thing. Christina Warren, she seemed into it. And a lot of people, as I walked out of this, because there was a break later, like as it ended and we all kind of left, there was this overarching question of what was that and why did we sit through that?
It sounds almost like a Andy Kaufman sort of anti-comedy thing, daring the audience to endure. And so the reason that I almost, I hope I'm not being too ungenerous to them, but the reason I jumped to thinking that that's what happened is that was kind of the whole vibe of Suck, in the sense that it was very much a Gen X sort of F the man,
yes,
middle finger at any sort of pretension. And so, as I said in that episode, if you listen to it, literally the whole Gawker, snarky vibe of blogging that came to prominence in the 2000s, they basically just cribbed the attitude of Suck. And so the reason that I jumped to that conclusion that they were doing some sort of a performance thing is because I feel like if they're still the same kind of guys with the same sort of attitude, that they would have the attitude that these stupid conferences that people pay all this money for, that's a bunch of BS.
Yeah, I feel at this point like it was clearly a performance of some kind, but what the intent was is ambiguous. Maybe that's kind of the point, because the PowerPoint or whatever it was not necessarily useful. The discussion was genuine in that these guys were trying to. It was very unusual. Let's just put it that way. It was a very unusual vibe, and a lot of people were kind of actively pissed off, kind of like like a Kaufman performance where people were just that annoyed that they would leave. But then other people were laughing directly with it. And I was in this nether zone where I was up in the balcony in the center front because I was shooting photos of the whole thing. And I have photos of this thing, by the way. Just kind of trying to figure out, like, yeah, I kind of remember suck.com. That was definitely a thing. I don't really remember these guys. It's been a long time. And and just trying to sit with the ambiguity of it for a long time. It did seem like there was a pattern where the one guy would try to explain his enthusiasm for something, and the other one would effectively negate that enthusiasm.
Right.
And that was it. There's no need for anything but them to express enthusiasm, and then the other one would just negate it, or try to, in some cases, one-up it, and then negate the whole idea of having the enthusiasm to begin with, and then they would move on to the next slide. And the slides were poorly designed is the wrong word, just oddly designed. As if they were intended to convey information, but they didn't, and they were very rarely explained or referenced. Even though a big show was put into, like, now let's advance to the next slide, this is very important. I think they went way over time, too. I think they went like 15 minutes over, which is kind of a lot when you have another 10 things.
I kind of want this to be true now because, listen, I love TED Talks as much as the next guy. I love attending, festivals and everyone loves to debate is South by Southwest. Oh, it's so over now,
Right.
But certainly these important talks that people hold where this next 10-minute presentation is going to change the way you look at the world and blow your mind. Like, certainly that's something that is ripe for people to take down a peg or two. So I want that to have been what they were doing. Because I really want, guys, I hope you're still out there with your middle finger out to the world, because that's what Suck was. And if they're still banging on and true to that vision, then man, that'd be great. And guys, if you're out there, please come on the podcast. I want to talk to you.
Yeah, and one more thought, which we could just chop out of this, is it felt like the old web, which, I mean, the old web was actually present at this thing to some extent, although, not in the form of actual, the entire suck.com crew. Mostly it was people who had come up in the last maybe 5 to 8 years and done something with a fancy new, like a new business model kind of deal. In a way, this was like, by the way, we've been doing this for a long time. So let's just express our view of this whole thing. It did push me back into the 90s. That's what it felt like.
Well, let me push you back in the 90s again, because that's kind of what you and I are really good at doing.
Oh, let's.
So you mentioned Glenn Fleischman, and there's a great recent podcast, an episode of is it The Incomparable or The Incomparable? I don't know what they.
The Incomparable.
Incomparable. Yeah, it's Jason Snell's podcast, and they were on there and they did an episode called "Passwords Are Wrong, Man," where they talk about like sort of the canon of tech hacker books, like literally Hackers, Soul of a New Machine by Tracy Kidder, Microsurfs by Douglas Copeland, and
The Cuckoo's Egg, maybe.
Yeah,
Cliff Stoll.
Yeah, Cuckoo's Egg was one of them, right?
Yeah.
And so that happened, and also last month or the month before there was it wasn't as big a deal as I thought it would be, but the 20th anniversary of Windows 95, and so all of this has been swirling together. I am 3 times he's canceled on me now, but I have a huge Microsoft guy that's like literally my dream Microsoft guy, aside from Bill Gates or Steve Ballmer. So I've been researching back Microsoft again recently, and I've been thinking specifically about Windows 95, and it helped me remember. I remember that there was hype around Windows 95, but a lot of the 20th anniversary press was like, well, this was like a new iPhone event, but 20 years ago, I remember there being a lot of hype around the launch of Windows 95. And I've seen, the video of people supposedly lining up and purchasing it at midnight and stuff. But I don't remember it being the launch of a new iPhone. Do you have any memories of Windows 95 launching? And were you a Mac user or Windows user at that point? What do you remember about that?
Yeah, I was a Windows 3.1 for work groups or whatever user at that time. And I agree with you because I've actually covered the same thing for Mental Floss, which is, we're getting into a lot of 25th and 30th anniversaries of a lot of stuff. And looking at that, and 20th, whatever, like looking at the coverage of Windows 95, it seems like either because I was in Southwest Florida and there was nothing going on there in general, or because nothing really happened there, it was a non-event. Like Windows 95 was something where I remember reading an article or two about it in a computer magazine and thinking, oh, that's nice. That'll be great.
Right.
Like,
right.
I look forward to
exactly.
having this OS.
Exactly.
I don't know who I'm going to pirate it from yet, but probably my dad because he'll get it at work or something. And that was the extent of it. I do recall hearing that the Rolling Stones had performed at something somewhere and Start Me Up was used, and that was
right.
something.
I remember that, and I also remember it was definitely like, if back in the day, if you were one of those people that would tune into the nightly news at 6:30 at night, it was definitely like the second or third story of the day. So it was, and listen, when you read the history and you research this stuff, I mean, they spent hundreds of millions of dollars. So, it better have been at least a headline. I'm sure it made newspaper headlines and things like that. And yeah, they had Jay Leno MC the launch event. They had that famous, if you're not aware of this, you need to Google this or YouTube search this right now. The cast of Friends.
Oh, yeah.
Was paid, I don't know how much amount of money, to do an intro video, like almost a how-to. These are all the cool things you can do with Windows 95. So believe me, they tried their best to make it a big event, but I don't remember there being like rabid fan. I don't remember like going to school and like all my nerd friends being like, oh my God, I got Windows 95 last night. I stayed up all night. I don't remember that at all.
Right. No, what I remember was a non-event. Like it didn't, I knew the kids who would have stayed up all night to go get a thing, and they didn't do that for that. Now again, I was geographically in a relatively remote part of the US, but we did stuff. We would go out for movies. We do like the midnight premiere of movies, but we were total dorks. I mean, to us, having a new OS for our computer was a big deal, but this wasn't. And I was aware, like in retrospect, I look at it and it feels as if Microsoft tried pretty hard to make a huge cultural event and moment. And from my perspective, just it didn't happen, I guess, which is fine. I mean, it happened clearly. Like they did release the OS, but it wasn't the kind of seemingly self-generated interest that you get with an iPhone launch.
Right. Well, and maybe that just wasn't the era for it. We do live in an era where the nerds have taken over the universe, and
yeah,
CEOs of tech companies are the new rock stars and things like that, and your phone is more sexy than the first car, to a 16-year-old. But I don't know. I actually, because I've done stuff for like the 20th anniversary of Amazon, 20th anniversary of Yahoo, 20th anniversary, obviously, of Netscape and things like that. But I didn't do anything on Windows 95 because it kind of, yes, I will, when you do the research on it, you can admit, and it's funny to look back at it now, you have to in retrospect, like, yes, that was the time when Microsoft was everything, was literally the tech industry, the computer industry, software industry, it was everything. And Windows 95 really represents their crowning achievement, their high watermark. But that's the funny thing, is that it is their kind of high watermark. And for 10 years after that, they continued to ride that monopoly of 95% market share of all software platforms. But it's so funny, as I'm, doing the research of I'm starting to get into when they get sued by the government and stuff. And, so Windows 95 happens in late 1995. It was supposed to come out originally in 1993. It comes out in late 95. 5 years later, Bill Gates leaves the day-to-day operations of Microsoft. Within 5 years, they're sued by the government. They kind of get a sort of severe slap on the wrist, but it was enough to maybe I don't know, take the fire out of them. And so it's weird when you think of Windows 95. It felt to me like a non-event, not a non-event, but not as big as people make it out to be. And then now when you look back on it historically, it's more interesting now as their high watermark.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it felt like the solidification of the ubiquity of Microsoft, which is really boring, right? Because ubiquity is super boring because nothing happened aside from the screen looked different now. And I recall my big questions about that OS being things like, can I get back to a DOS prompt? And like, is this a shell over DOS or
that's
a whole
funny.
new thing?
I thought of that too. I made a note of that, because I used Windows 3.1 also, but remember that was just running on top of, you were still using a DOS machine. It was just a cute layer they had put. You could get back to the command line anytime you wanted. Yeah. And that was always the reason why I was a Windows kid and not a Mac kid, is because I actually enjoyed the ability to go to the C prompt and do whatever crazy shit I wanted to do, get into the weeds. And so I always liked that. So maybe even, maybe at the time I would have felt like, oh, this is sort of a step backwards. They're turning it into Macs, which, again, now you would say, oh, that was such a positive thing. They finally caught up to the Mac. But as a kid that really loved the command line, really loved the C prompt, I think I can even remember being like, yeah, well, I guess I can't do all the great stuff I used to do when I could just hack into DOS.
But they gave you new stuff like the registry, right? I don't think that really existed prior to that, I assume. But it gave you these new awful things that you had to do to rebuild your PC every year or so. There's sort of seasonal cleaning of reinstalling everything and trying to figure out what was wrong. And I got into that lore pretty deeply. I got into Windows NT, 3.5.1 or 4 in the coming years after that. But I recall being very proud of my ability to do things like, mess with my autoexec.bat and my config.sys, because you had to right. Certain games would not run unless they had access to memory in certain ways. And I also ran a weird variant of DOS, which was digital research. It was DR DOS instead of MS DOS, which there was no reason to run it. I mean, I'll just put it out there. Like, it was the only reason to run that was to say, I am a better nerd than my friends who are also nerds.
Dude, you know what? I'm not, it's been so long since I researched this, but DR DOS, if memory serves correctly, was one of the early instances that made the government start to kind of look at Microsoft. Like the dirty things they did to DR DOS. And I might be completely wrong about this because, again, it was almost 2 years ago that I was deep in the weeds with Microsoft. But yeah, so because that was some other company's version of DOS. Yeah. Because there were all these different versions of DOS originally. Microsoft made different. There was the version they made for IBM, for different OEMs, and then Compaq started using the MS DOS, just their plain vanilla version. And then that sort of became, okay, well, everyone's just going to, instead of being PC DOS, everyone just uses MS DOS. So.
Right. Well, yeah, it was what it struck me as, just as a user at the time, was, well, okay, so if this is kind of an interoperable system, if the whole point of the PC versus something like a Mac is that you can take off-the-shelf components and you can kind of reverse engineer things and make them just work, then you can take your DOS and reverse engineer that and make that just work. And I honestly don't recall why DR DOS was impressive or useful, except I think it had some kind of memory management thing that was supposedly better. But like many things in those days, that belief was probably based on something somebody told me one time. And if it was somebody I felt was reliable or better than me at computers, I just took it on board and said, well, I'm going to use DR DOS until they take it away from me, So yeah, that was just an example of, I think Windows 95, if I recall correctly, it sort of just took over. Like, you didn't get to have your DR DOS anymore. And that was probably fine. I think at that point I didn't really need the command line as much as I felt that I did. And that was the beginning of that kind of change. And it was such an interesting thing to go from that moment of having a command line that I felt that I had some skills with, And then very shortly thereafter being exposed to Unix in college and being like, oh, look at this, a real command line, like a grown-up command line. And then having that be a thing that I did a lot. And then getting into the Mac. This is the Mac pre-OS 10. So you have like Mac OS 8 and 7 and 9 and stuff, which were, there was no command line to be had. But then finally coming full circle to having, a Unix-based Mac that's when you knew you had won. Like we had won so hard that we had all the possible things.
Right after they bought Next and created OS 10, well, it wasn't first OS 10. Listen, I don't want to embarrass myself because I don't know Apple history at all. So.
Oh, Brian, I'll tell you all about it some other day.
We're right. Well, you know what? Do you know who Benedict Evans is?
No.
He works. I don't know if he's a partner, but he's with Andreessen Horowitz. He's on their excellent podcast very often. He is one of the greatest follows on Twitter because he's always tweeting data points and sometimes charts and data that their research arm does about web stuff. And he had a tweet a couple of weeks ago that was great where he said, what's funny is that maybe it might turn out that the Google search field might be the last command line in existence. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, because that's how computers before mice and Windows and things and the whole GUI interface took over, all of computing for about 50 years was, all right, there's a command line, a blinking cursor, and you have to type in what you want it to do. And essentially that's what the Google search still is. And he's kind of right. Like, where else is there, even ATMs are now touch screens. Like, where else is there a command line in any computing?
Yeah, it's a solid point. And also there is a bunch of stuff you can do in Google and other search engines too, but like notably Google, because I use a lot of Google. Like, one of the things I use every day is the site syntax. So you can type site : and then the URL of some domain, let's say in my case, mentalfloss.com, because I write every day for this thing. And so I want to search this domain on which I've written thousands of things. And then I search for keywords and stuff. You can also search by like date ranges and stuff.
Right.
By adding operators. So basically I want to know, like, has anybody here, maybe possibly me, because I forgot about it because it was 8 years ago, have we covered this topic? And if we have, for example, when I posted the thing with, I feel like it was Chandler and Monica?
No, or was it both the two dudes? No, one of them had to be a woman. Yeah.
Yeah, and
maybe
it was
Phoebe.
I never watched the show. I'm going to admit that right now. I actually never watched that show. And
that's
my wife
crazy.
Is
First of all, that's
now.
crazy. To be the age you are, that's crazy. Did you see the New York Times article that just this week about how apparently teens are embracing, because it's on Netflix now, are embracing Friends, and it's having this cultural moment. And they were contrasting it to, like, the Sex and the City version of living in New York, and the girls version of living in New York, and I can totally see that. But this is such an aside. I can totally see Friends having another moment, because it is sort of, and again, you can't comment because you haven't watched that much of it, but it is even more than Seinfeld. I feel like it's maybe more of a universal comedy where, you can go back to Three Stooges, or you can go back. I can't think off the top of my head of another a comedy that's sort of evergreen, but I can totally see that even a 17-year-old today would laugh their ass off at Friends episodes.
Yeah, I think for me the analog would be Laverne and Shirley, and I honestly forget what city they were in. I mean, was that maybe
Milwaukee?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, yeah.
But they're going to the bottling factory and stuff.
It's definitely Milwaukee.
And I would watch that and just think, this is from an era a little bit before mine, but it's on the TV and I'll watch it. And I kind of understand roughly who these characters are. But yeah, you do that. I do this thing a lot. This has become one of my, as I kind of get more and more gray, sort of my looking at where I am relative to the kids these days. And we had like a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old over the other day. And I looked at these kids and I'm like, whoa, these are both post iPhone kids.
Oh, yeah.
And they're walking up to the TV set and trying to press it, and it doesn't do anything. And so I'm like, wow, because I thought, we have a 13-year-old niece who's like, she's post 9/11 for one thing.
Right.
But we share a lot of culture. But, a 2 or 3-year-old today we share, like, I'm aware vaguely of what culture that kid is, because I'm seeing, whatever their parents tell the kid, but their computing ability is so interesting to watch because I'm like, huh. Because the thing is, you and I had a computing culture where we sat down in front of a machine with a little prompt, a little carrot that said, do something. And you would sort of have to use some external source other than the computer itself to tell you how to do something.
Right. What was the word that you used? The search something, the parameters or something that you...
operators.
Operators, right, exactly. So that comes directly. See, that's the funny thing when they always talk about how maybe Google's in trouble because they really come from a desktop paradigm. Well, yeah, those operators, that comes directly from coming up on computers where, yes, you sit down, there's a blinking cursor, and there's not icons to click. You have to know the funny code, not code, but you have to remember, okay, to open a file, I have to do this. Mm-hmm. To find a directory, I have to do this. It was not intuitive at all. Listen, you can give a 2-year-old an iPhone today and they can operate it. A 2-year-old, a 79-year-old, pretty much that's the whole point of the GUI revolution is that the old command line computers were not intuitive at all. You had to learn the arcane way to do it.
Yeah, and you had asked me about the idea of what it was like to live with DOS or sort of live through that transition from a command line thing to a GUI thing. And I definitely lived straight through that. I liked DOS. I thought it was cool. I was proud of my skills that because I had to build them up. I had to go read books about that stuff. I learned to program BASIC and Pascal and stuff. And so I felt that by gaining mastery over that thing, which was the only way to use it to do much, that sort of engendered a sense that I don't know how to put this. I loved the machine. Like, I loved my own ability to be master of this machine. And as things became easier to use, there's a tendency, I think, for some people to feel like, oh no, like the unwashed masses are coming in onto my lawn and using the secret tools that only I had the lore to use. And it was never an intellectual capacity thing. It was more like, well, I put in the time, man. I put in the time, and I'll show you and stuff.
I paid my dues, yeah.
Well, and this came up at one point. I went to library science school. So I came home with my degree, my freshly minted, degree in library and information studies. I don't call it science. And then later they dropped the library from that and just called it information studies or science. And I sat down with my mother who wanted to do some genealogical research, and I was showing her the Google because this was 1999. And so the Google, I said, is much better than the Alta Vista or the whatever else, the dog pile. And I'm showing her these Google operators that I'd learned probably a year or two before, like putting things in quotes and using brackets and all this other stuff. And I said, you definitely want to do this. If you want both words, you put the whole thing in quotes, then you do this and that and the other thing. And we're not quite finding the results that she's sort of looking for. And she said, well, what if I just typed the thing I'm looking for? And I literally scoffed because I was that, I'm that guy. And said, well, it's not going to work because, I've just been through several years of intense training in this topic. So she just types in the thing she wants, and it works better than my dumb, carefully constructed database-driven searchy query thing.
Typing in, where was Tom Petty born?
Right. She just types some stuff in, and it gets back to, the first hit is, the exact thing, and I'm just floored because effectively Google has just rendered my education useless. Right? Which is like, at the same time as it's great for everybody, that my folks can use this now and there's no barrier there, I also think, well, crap.
Yeah.
Like, what can I teach myself real quick that nobody else knows? And that's sort of the history of being a tech person. You kind of pick up a thing and you can be not a master of that domain, but at least be really conversant in a slightly arcane place for ever decreasing periods of time. It used to be you could be a master of a thing for 5 years and then some new thing would come out. Now it's like 3 months and then everybody figures, well,
yeah, with languages too. I mean, it's crazy like that, but that makes me think though of like Siri and, obviously, so if we're saying that the Google search bar is the last command line, yeah, but even all of those parameters and things go away because they already have basically natural language search in terms of typing it in and then eventually we're going to be talking to Siri like they do on Star Trek: The Next Generation, and so
Yeah.
so maybe he's wrong. The command line's going away anyway, but so also thinking about this, and so now since you brought up Google, this is thinking about going back to Microsoft. Again, thinking of Windows 95 as being their high watermark, and I'll obviously be doing more work on how everybody was afraid of Microsoft until late into the 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
But it made me think of, there is a real, it's not a horse race, but there's a real chronology to, in Silicon Valley, who is the dominant company that is driving the industry forward. And it was absolutely Microsoft from, let's say, 1990 to maybe 97, 98, certainly 95, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, the web comes and the dot-com era, and then, I don't know. But then clearly it was Google. Google takes the mantle. Google is where all the smart people are. And the way that you measure this is, where do all the smart people want to work, right?
Right.
Because you and I can both remember in 2000 till about 2004, everybody, like, that was the place to work. Google was where all the great stuff was happening, all the smartest people. And in some ways it can evolve in terms of, okay, especially now, where are the stock options going to make you the most money?
Yeah.
But I mean, come 2004 till definitely, I don't know, their IPO, it was definitely Facebook. So Microsoft, then Google, then Facebook, and then, maybe you would argue Apple, because, listen, when the iPhone comes out, and especially the App Store, no one can argue that all of a sudden computing and technology was being driven forward by that insane great run of basically the 5 years from the iPhone to the iPad. But so this is all leading to what I was thinking about, which is, what is that company today? Because I don't feel like it's Apple anymore. And again, you can measure it by, okay, where do people want to go to get rich off of stock options? So by that metric, it would be obviously Uber, but I kind of, if you ask me who is the company that all the smart tech people want to work at today, aside from getting rich, they want to go where the best work is being done. I don't know that I have an answer, and I don't know that you would have an answer either, but what does that make you think of? Like, who has the mantle today?
From where I sit, there was a time, and I think that time is over, where Apple clearly became a thing. I remember a friend of mine who must remain nameless, but a friend of mine from Florida repeatedly was offered jobs at Apple and repeatedly said no. And he was smart enough to do it. He had the background to do it. He would have done a great job. But effectively, he said, I can't give up my lifestyle, my family, move across the country and give everything to any company. And if I ever were to do so, it would definitely be Apple. Or maybe Google, but really Apple, because this is a guy who's really an Apple guy. And he would occasionally call me and say, yep, I got another offer, and I don't know. And sometimes they wouldn't even tell what team. The offers were very vague, but, this guy got to meet Steve Jobs, who was like, please come work for us, do this thing. And he said no. He doesn't regret it. He's done very well for himself. And the thing that I think is different now is that I think people, and I don't know if this is a millennial shift or something, I think people want to make their own thing. I don't think that the thing that I set out to do with getting kind of a dot-com-y degree in the 90s and intentionally trying to go to Seattle and then stopping one step short and ending up in Portland, the plan was to go to Seattle and to work for maybe Microsoft, maybe Adobe, or probably a startup, because who knew, right?
Yeah, because we definitely need to stress that, again, when Microsoft was dominant in the early 90s, especially in the mid 90s, around the era of Windows 95, Microsoft was where the smart people were. Totally. There's Microsurf, the Douglas Copeland book, which I believe neither of us have read, but like that was the culture at the time, that if you're smart, if you want to get rich, you're going to go to Seattle and you're going to work for Microsoft.
Yeah, and a couple of my friends did, which is also kind of weird. I realized I have probably 4 or 5 friends who, at some point in their career from the late 90s through now, spent some stint at Microsoft, because it's kind of hard to avoid if that's where you live. If you live around the Seattle area, you're just going to end up doing some Microsoft stuff. And some of that was like Xbox, and some of that was UI, UX stuff. And so, they would take a kind of a detour through that. In the same way that in Oregon, people tend to take a detour through Intel. Like a lot of people here have worked in some way for or at Intel. Like I still sometimes work with a large chip maker in the Pacific Northwest that I'm not supposed to really name. But, the guy who first hired me at my first startup here was a direct Intel kind of grad. And I've still worked with that guy for 15 years now. And now I'm interviewing him for films and stuff, even though, so like, as my role has changed, he's still working, with and around the Intel sphere in the same way the Microsoft sphere was dominant just one state away from us. The other thing that happens in Oregon, by the way, is that there were other companies around here that aren't quite as dominant. Like you'd have Tektronix. A lot of people were, I think that's a little bit of an older demographic as far as I could tell. People would go through tech in maybe the 80s. That was still pretty common. But by the time I got here, that was not like a thing that you would aim for. But McAfee, Symantec.
Right.
You had various, oddly, like multiple antivirus companies based here.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird.
Remember how big antivirus was as an industry at a time?
Oh yeah,
at a period in
and
time?
not sleazily. It was an actually interesting, vibrant space for a while.
Yeah.
And now it feels to me, from as a smug Mac user, I'm like, well, good for you and your thing. But actually, I know a guy who works for. I always forget which one it is, but he works for one of these things. Brilliant guy, basically deep thinker, former hacker, has all these crazy stories about selling pirated floppy disks out of the trunk of his car and stuff. Like genuinely smart people who go to work at lots of different companies. But to get back to your actual question, I really think that the lore of the startup is why we no longer have so many of these. It's like as we kind of realized and decided that we weren't going to go and work for IBM for 50 years and then retire with a pension, as that became clear that wasn't an option for our next jobs, it was like, well, do we go to the next IBM, which was like Microsoft or Google or whatever, or we just make our own thing and try to get rich and then see what happens after that? And a lot of people, myself included, did that second thing, just tried to go for a startup and roll the dice.
Well, I get that. And again, I want to stress, it's not just about the getting rich, because one of my main points would be that, especially in the early 2000s, people that wanted to work at Google wanted to work there because that's where the interesting stuff was happening. That's where all the smart people were. And so that's sort of like maybe it requires a company, because Google was the paradigm shifter that brought the web out of the dot-com nuclear winter, that set up Web 2.0. Facebook was the living embodiment of Web 2.0 and social media, this whole revolution. So when people wanted to work at Facebook, sure, you could make your millions, but also that's where the new paradigm of tech was springing forth from. So again, maybe there's not a company right now that is that you can say is the standard bearer for the new paradigm. Like maybe it's Snapchat. Listen, I'm not poo-pooing Uber, and it's obviously has the potential to revolutionize transportation, which is not a small thing. I get all that, but if some kid came out of college and said, I want to work at the smart company where all the smart people are, where the future is being made, and listen, Google would argue that they are that company.
Sure. No. Yeah. And
but
the thing is,
I don't. It doesn't roll off the top of my head who that company is right now today.
Yeah. What just came to mind? Tesla.
Sure. Right.
Or SpaceX.
Okay.
So the Tesla verse, the Muskaverse.
That would be where the smart people that want to challenge themselves and want to invent the future, that's where they would think they would go.
I think for a certain kind of nerd, yeah. Because I think that that's actually something where, I think my brother faced a similar kind of challenge when he graduated with an actual CS degree, with actual higher education, like higher education. He had the opportunity to go with a small startup or an established startup. So get in early and maybe make a big splash and be like the main brain, or be one of like 10 huge brains in this awesome thing. And he chose the latter. He chose to go with other smart people, and then eventually spun off and became the CTO of his own company. And that idea of these slightly smaller companies, that don't spring to mind, I don't think Tesla is not a top of mind company for me. SpaceX is probably higher in my awareness because, let's face it, I'm on their PR list because they keep, throwing stuff into space, and saying, hey, tune in tomorrow. But I do think that if you look for where the smart people are, I'm betting that they're trying to kind of align themselves around Elon Musk at the moment. But I agree that that's nowhere near the cultural currency that that Microsoft had or that Google still has. And Microsoft, you can't sneeze at it, but I also want to disclose, I've done work with the Gates Foundation, which is not the same thing as Microsoft, but it's very, very similar in some ways. But it's not culturally, those companies are so big and so known, and they really are and really were doing the smart people stuff, that even things like their test questions to get in are famous, maybe infamous, but nonetheless, something that people would talk about just as a topic of conversation. Can you believe how smart you would have to be to go even try to work there?
Yeah, which is always BS because you think that there's a place where all the smart people are, but it turns out that everyone's faking it and no one really knows anything. But that's my own personal prejudice.
But can we pause on that for a second? We just dwell on that. I think that's a thesis of startups. That's what I took away from being in startups through the 2000s, was that, honestly, and this is a pessimistic view, but I took away the view that nobody knows what they're doing. Everyone's making it up. And it's more about whether you're good at making it up or finding somebody who will help you make it up in the proper way. But there are relatively few people who go into a startup knowing precisely all the waters they're going to have to tread.
No, none of them. Listen, it's mostly luck, and it's luck. But then the real genius is somebody that lucks into it, but then is the right person to take advantage of that luck. And Zuckerberg would be top of mind. I don't think anyone would have imagined that Mark Zuckerberg would turn out to be a good corporate CEO. It turns out he is. And so that's an accident. So he accidentally lucked into creating the perfect social network. He wasn't the first. He might not have been the best. Maybe there was someone that would have created a better one. But once he landed on that luck, it turns out that he was the right person. So I'm more convinced that that's where the genius comes in the same way you could say the same thing about Bill Gates. I'm not saying that there aren't geniuses. I'm just saying that the genius that wakes up and looks across the field of society or technology and says, this is my vision and I'm going to see it all the way through, those basically don't exist. Maybe Steve Jobs being the exception that proves the rule. But then what I'm saying, my theory would be the real genius is the one that lucks into something really good and then turns out to be the right person to see that to fruition.
Yeah, and I think there's a case for Gates as being, as far back as the mid-70s, writing the letter to hobbyists.
Right, absolutely.
There's such a clear vision. And all that letter says is software has value. Which was a controversial idea at the time. At the time, software had no value and hardware had all the value.
All the value.
But then going on to then make all the money selling software for the next 30 years.
But that's what I'm saying. I agree with you that Gates had the vision that software was the value proposition for computing. And I understand that, but he backed into one of the greatest businesses of all time just by having the drive to be like, I want every machine on the planet to run my software.
Yeah.
And so this is what I'm saying. This is sort of my thesis, is that, okay, it turns out that he was absolutely the right guy to see that to fruition and make that happen. And I'm not, I'm not saying this to diminish or poo-poo anybody's. I'm saying actually that's where the genius lies. The genius lies in, because there's tons of people that can luck into a great business idea, a great company, and then look, they're not qualified to actually make it into a great company. Or so the real genius are the people that it turns out when luck knocks them over the head, it turns out that, you know what? I'm the guy that deserved to get that lottery ticket because I know what to do with it. Right.
Well, I wanted to ask you this before the podcast. So in the process of interviewing all these people and synthesizing the history of this era, I keep wondering whether you put your head on the pillow at night and just start thinking of new startup ideas. Do you know what I mean? Because you're exposed to,
it's so,
go ahead.
As recently as maybe 5 years ago, that used to happen to me all the time. It doesn't happen to me now.
Really?
That might just be literally that might be a function of age.
Uh-huh.
Which actually we'll get to in a second because that's my next topic for you. But you know what's interesting, you were just having talked about this makes me think of it, is the thing that I have to guard about when I'm interviewing people is because I think intrinsically most of the people that are interviewed on the show understand that if you can get them to be honest, in the middle of the night, they understand that they got lucky. Mm-hmm. But everybody then wants to do the hagiography of how, oh yeah, listen, here's how I did my brilliant thing. So I'm always trying, not in an aggressive way, not in a I'm a journalist way, but I'm trying to guard against the, when someone comes on the show and interviews about their startup in the 90s, and I don't want them to just be like, well, because clearly I was a genius and I saw this and I saw that. I kind of always try to steer them in the direction of, okay, but at the time, what did you see? Like, how did you make this decision that did end up working out for you in the end? Like, try to put yourself back there. Like, the tendency is for people, and maybe doing this has made me think that way about people. You get lucky, you luck into it, and then do you have the mettle to turn it into something?
Yeah.
And so I'm not trying to be aggressive with people, but I always try to steer it away from, well, of course, the reason I was successful with this company was because I'm a genius and I had the vision from day one. No, you didn't. I guarantee you did not,
Yeah, no, I've run into that quite a bit. I think for me, the most interesting and challenging example of that was when I interviewed Brewster Kahle, who is now best known, I think, for the Internet Archive, but he also co-invented Waze. And he
at the Google thingy.
At the Google thingy? No, he was at he was
Waze. You're saying
Waze, WAIS, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking of what am I thinking of?
A different Brewster, possibly?
No, a different Waze. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, well, but the point is, this is a guy who is super brilliant, like so brilliant that you go and you watch all of these interviews he's given, and I've seen him. You can watch him because also he's an archivist, so he wants you to upload your raw interview. So my raw interview right after we did this, and I've never done this with anybody else, but he asked, so I said, yeah, okay. He said, let's pull the memory card out of your thing and upload it to the archive right now. And I said, okay. So you can go on Internet Archive right now and search for like Chris Higgins, Brewster Kahle, and listen to about an hour of kind of echoey bad sound of me trying to get something out of a guy who has told his origin story, I don't know how many times, 100 times. But I had seen archival footage of him talking to interviewers who fundamentally had no idea who he was or why he mattered or why any of his work might go together. And I had tried to get to things that weren't going to trigger him to just tell you the hagiography of his thing. Not that he's intentionally doing that, but it's that thing where if you're like a book author or something, the 40th time somebody says, well, how'd you get the idea for the book? You just tell some dumb narrative because you want to kind of get past that question. You just, that's what's in your mind now. You've developed a story. That's the narrative you want to move on.
Or if you're eBay, you invent a narrative that was all about Pez dispensers.
That Pez thing is great. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
And fascinating that you would turn that up as intentionally, placing the wrong flag. I think that's really smart.
Well, it was just a simple, cute thing that, it was a great PR idea. PR genius right there.
Well, it's the kind of thing I would actually recommend if people are going to have a business or a book or anything today. Go ahead and make something up. Like, what's the origin story of this? Well, I fell on my head in the bathtub and I invented the flux capacitor.
I 1,000% agree with you.
Yeah, have a eureka moment, even if the eureka moment really took you 4 years of hard research,
Because again, if you're buying into my theory that it's all accidental anyway and luck, then what difference does it make? And eventually when some dumb historian like me comes around, you can tell them the true story and give them a scoop, I guess.
Yeah.
I had said earlier the next topic has to do with age, and one of the reasons that I do analysis episodes that I love talking to you is it's sort of like hype checking me. And so one of the things that has been I'm deep in the .com research right now. One of the reasons I wanted to do this project is because I love the .com era. I love the bubble. I love all this stuff, and it still seems relevant because every day there's another think piece on Medium about how we are or aren't in a new bubble, and the bubble for Silicon Valley, the .com bubble, is sort of like what the Great Depression was for our grandparents. this,
Yeah.
this thing that's always going to come back, or to, if you're an economist, it's the inflation of the 70s is always going to come back, despite the fact that it hasn't for almost a decade now. But I'm kind of hype checking myself and asking you to hype check me, because it's occurred to me that the .com era, as I'm researching it and remembering all this stuff, and it's nostalgia for me, I'm starting to wonder, is it just nostalgia for me? Because this was when are you at your best in life? When you're coming out of college and the world's your oyster and you can do anything. And you and I are about the same age. And so remember, man, when we were graduating from college, it was like everybody's getting rich. The whole world is changing. We're inventing new ways of living, man. Do you remember? Like, that's not hyperbole. That was literally what people were feeling at the time. But I'm wondering, is it just in the same way that, for my dad, Pink Floyd, there's never going to be better music than Dark Side of the Moon. And for me, there's never going to be a better album than OK Computer. Is it?
Yeah.
Is the .com era only... I think it's interesting. I think it's important, but is it more important to me because, man, that's when I was 24 and the world was at my feet? Hype check me.
Yes, it is that. Every generation thinks that they're the biggest deal. And I think that that's a reality that we have to face and embrace. But the thing that we lived through is by definition the most important thing to us. So, if you look back over even short time scales, if you look back to like our own parents and you think, so when were they our age? In the case of my mother and father, I'm going to do some quick math. That would be like late 60s, right? Maybe early 70s. And so they actually, oh boy, it's so funny. I just thought of what is my own age, and I started adding 20 years on. And I'm 37, right? So anyway, no, it would be like the early 80s. But just thinking about, when would they be hitting that kind of 20 something, like you're kind of at the prime of your ability to...
Where like I always think about it like, I definitely know I don't know what the great music is right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or like, when you knew when Borat or Napoleon Dynamite bubbled up, but you were one of the first people to know that was a thing. Like, I'm clearly too old to know what the Borat or Napoleon Dynamite or the great new band of today is. But yes, so this is exactly what I'm saying. And I think it's when you come out of college, it's maybe when you start your first job, you're plugged in to pop culture. You know what the new thing is. You know what the smart people are eating, listening to, the movies they're watching. Like you are plugged in, man. And that was 1999 for me. Man.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things I think about this a lot. One of them is the people who create the majority of the culture, at least in my reading of the last 50 years, are often in their 30s. The people who are like the most sort of at the combination of like the top of their game and the enough experience to get their creative thing out there. So if you look at, I've been researching Jim Henson a lot lately. So if you look at that guy and you look at when the contributions he made that were the most interesting and long-term would lead to the later contributions, he was like 31 to 35. So this is the late 60s into mid 70s. That was this period where he was kind of at the height of his power. And this also comes about when you're like a writer or reporter, where you reach an age where you have I think a window. And the window is, I'm old enough that I can talk to the real graybeards and people and still have enough cultural touchstones that I can at least kind of play, right? Like I can say, I understand what the Summer of Love is. I wasn't there because I wasn't born, but I kind of get it. But I get it enough because there were still some hippies around, sort of, like the ones that had survived the 70s. I saw them and then they were swept away, right? But I can also speak to younger people because I'm right in the middle, right? And I'm going to exit this area at some point, right? Like at some point I'm necessarily going to become, and I'm already there with things like music, as you suggested. I'm already stuck on my music from 1989 to about 2002 or something.
Right. Yeah.
It's rare that I find new stuff.
Because I'm 37 too, and I've given up. I know that the last great album that will ever be released in my mind will be the last LCD Sound System album. Like, like that's just the sound that I need, and I don't need anything else. And I'm sorry, you know.
Yeah.
Like, I just know that now.
Yeah, you collect your things, and you're at some point you cease to invest your time in certain cultural things, right? So the people who make or have the, let's say, the opportunity to make those kinds of connections, and you're going about this right now, like you're going about interviewing a bunch of people who are primarily a good bit older than you, but not a ton older. You know, like you were still there, you still had a taste of that experience, and so you can relate to them, not quite at the age peer, but as an experience peer, right? So you can say, yeah, you know, I get it, and I've talked to enough of you people, like, you know, we're there. If you go forward 15 years, that may be harder for you to do with people who are, you know, substantially younger or older, right? Because the younger people, you won't share the same culture with them. You won't know what their touchstones are, what they mean when they say like, oh, Blobbity Blook Band is amazing. You'll just kind of,
right.
I have to be like, I don't really know what Justin Bieber is. I don't really know any songs.
Right.
I couldn't name a song, right? So anyway, the point is, like, I do think that generations believe that they're the biggest deal, and that's a human trait. In the same way that every generation thinks that they may well be the last, and that's why we have apocalypticism as part of our sort of human makeup, and that's why we keep thinking the world is going to end, and it's going to end within our times. We're going to see the end. That is just a fundamental part of what it is to be human.
Well, and it's a fundamental universal trait that, man, it's worse off now. You know, the way we did it was better. We were so much smarter. The kids today are so much dumber. If this was the 1950s, it would be because they watch TV all the time. You know, like the music is not as good. Right. It's essentially
kids these days.
Chris, what you're telling me is waves cane, get off my lawn. This is a natural part of aging. So
yes. I think we need to, as a culture, be okay with that. And then just understand that from that perspective, that I feel so deeply that I'm like, man, I lived through this rockin' like 90s thing with like, I understand how lame that already sounds, right? Oh, you know, let me give you a good anecdote. My dad used to work at an AM radio station in Florida. And one day he came in, it was an oldies station. One day he came in and he said, we have started the process of updating all of the records. We're throwing out the 30s and we're putting in the 40s. And I was like, whoa. This is an oldies station. The oldies are the oldies. And he said, you don't understand. What's happened is the people who listen to the music of the 30s they're dead now. The people who listen to the music of the 40s are, you know, demographically speaking, they're where it's at for my AM radio station in Southwest Florida. So we need to cater to them. And I realized as like a 5-year-old that the oldies were a moving concept. So fast forward 32 years and oldies now has Nirvana on it. You know?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so you're like, whoa, ho, ho. But the realization that you're in a continuum of people who are caught up in their little moments is super important. And also realizing that at some point, you know, like we saw the advent of touchscreens, right? And in the same way that these children I spoke about earlier, like these little kids, like they were born into a world of primarily touchscreens.
Right.
No
command lines.
We have a few of those state transitions left, right? Like we came from command lines. We came from nothing. We came from typewriters to command lines to network computers to, like, you know, portable computers to computers in your pocket to touch interfaces, and
now onto VR.
Right. And so at some point in there, you're going to lose me, right? At some point, I'm going to be like, well, you know, I'm just going to start writing letters.
Checking out, yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of like you can make fun of like a parent or a grandparent and say like, well, it's so funny that they still save all their data on floppies or something, but that's inevitable. And in some ways, you can celebrate that in a nostalgic way, or not even celebrate it, just admit it. Like that's sort of where you have to live. And I keep watching myself for when that happens to me in technology, and I think it already happens to me in a lot of filmmaking technology. Like I'm starting not to care about things like 4K video and, you know, because to me, I'm like, you know what, DVDs look awesome, frankly. Like my vision is sufficiently poor that to me a DVD is about right. And Blu-ray, yeah, it looks definitely better, but does it need to look better than Blu-ray?
Right.
So
right.
I find myself just sort of in the early stages of realizing that I have fallen off the thing that I always loved, which was just because technology got better and gives us a higher quality thing, I don't actually care anymore.
Well, I don't want to scare listeners. I am still super excited about researching and because I one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast was I want to tell the story of the .com bubble, and I want to do it justice. So I'm not saying that I'm reassessing how important it was, but as I'm looking at the continuum of the history, I'm realizing that that just was the web, but the web is not what the internet era is all about, and it's not. So I'm not. Don't worry, people. I'm still super excited to tell the story of the .com companies and the craziness and there is value to, again, that's what history is I was there. I remember that crazy the millennial feeling of it's the year 2000 is coming, and it really did feel like everybody was getting rich, everything was awesome, we're changing the world. You can get into the 9/11 chronology and stuff like that, but yeah, man, I was there. I'm telling you, 1998, 1999 fucking rocked.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, I mean, and I think celebrate that, right? Like celebrate that in the same way that you could say if you were alive in 68 and 69, pretty much everything that happened in those 2 years. If you look like, I mean, yeah, sure, the Tet Offensive and all this other stuff. There's a lot of, and the assassination of a very important president, like sure,
lots of riots,
lots of other stuff that happened. But if you're going to boil it down to a couple of years, and you said, you know what, I was there, that was a big deal. We put dudes on the moon, and then we kept doing it, and like that's friggin' amazing. So celebrate that, and it's not like I'm just saying celebrate it and be aware that your posture towards that thing is colored by the fact that you were there, but you were there, and like the number of people who were there will dwindle. That's
right, exactly.
This is it, and we're not going to make any more of them. So the ones who were there and who have like an operable memory of it, you'd better record it now, because as you've discussed in past episodes, this is history that will be lost and is important. It may not be for us to decide whether this is more or less important than other things in the 20th century, right? Like world wars are probably more important than the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's probably like bigger in certain ways than like, did we get a great search engine? But in other ways, you know what? You might look back and say, actually putting computers in everyone's pockets or whatever, making iPads or some moment in that spectrum fundamentally did change lives in a way that will seem unthinkable.
Well,
I think that's already happened to us.
And was informed by the .com bubble. If again, there's utility to looking back at what the bubble was and what it wasn't, and so not only identifying if you're in another one, but again, I'm super excited about telling that story, but I want to. I almost swore we were only going to do an hour, but let's end with when they did that great Incomparable podcast about the great books, the great tech books, made me think again. Let's combine these two ideas. What are the great internet movies? And so we're talking about 1999.
The Net.
Well, no, of course it's not the Net, and of course it's not Hackers. No.
Sneakers? Those kind of pre-internet.
No, none of those. So it made
You've
me realize,
got mail, perhaps.
You got mail. You can make an argument.
Yeah, you can make an argument, right? Because it's kind of it's an online service.
It's a very specific point in time when AOL did seem to be the internet to a lot of people. But no, I am realizing. Speaking of 1999, listen, the quintessential, at least, .com era movie, and possibly the quintessential internet movie, is the first Matrix. Discuss.
Okay,
you just rewatched it recently.
Well, I had a glass of white wine, and I sat down with my devices, and I watched this motion picture last night, and I have a lot to say about this thing. I have not seen this movie probably since like 2002 or 3, because I saw it when it came out, and it blew my mind, and then I saw it probably when it came out on DVD, something like that.
Oh, by the way, everyone had it on DVD because it was when DVDs sort of became prevalent, was around the release of The Matrix. So they were giving that away. I was working at Blockbuster at the time, so I can vouchsafe for this. But everybody had the Matrix DVD because it was the thing that everyone was like, okay, I want to see what this DVD technology is, everyone had the Matrix DVD. But go on.
Right. Well, so just watching the film, there is one thing that from almost moment one just screams at me. And this gets it back again to the kids these days, which is the primacy in the Matrix of telephones.
Yes.
Telephones are the central metaphor
Payphones,
for everything.
By the way.
Payphones. Well, yeah. Payphones is one thing. They also have cell phones.
Okay, I was going to say that because to this day, I might be willing to trade in my iPhone for the Nokia, I believe it is, phone.
Yeah, like Nokia's slider phone.
The Morpheus slider phone is the sexiest electronic device that I have ever seen.
It's got a cool like chunk when you slide it out. Yeah.
And
well,
also what's interesting about that is also this was in the day, which I still believe in. I miss these days, when the whole thing was getting a smaller phone. We're in an era where everyone wants bigger phones, but no, the cool thing was a phone so small that it basically just kind of was the size of your ear. And I had that Nokia, whatever. Oh, crap. I should have researched that before we did this. I had that super small Nokia. I'll put it in the show notes.
One or what?
It was literally maybe 3 inches tall, you know?
Yeah.
I'll definitely research it and put it in the show notes. That's still my favorite phone of all time. Yeah. And actually the most reliable phone I've ever used as a phone. But anyway, I interrupted you. Go on.
Well, okay. But so the thing is, kids who were born after this movie will never understand. I mean, I think we'll only look at it as some kind of quaint, anachronistic thing that first of all, there are phone booths located all over this city, and that they are important, and that they are hard lines, which also is a concept that doesn't really exist.
That's how you jack into the Matrix.
You have to jack in, that's how you kind of, and also that downloading and uploading yourself requires you to go to a place.
Yeah.
Right? And so, but this is so culturally, important because if you were sort of a child of the 80s and 90s and you're writing this movie, you would say, well, of course it's the telephone line. Of course that is the central way that we network, right? And so somehow you have this undersea floating machine that requires a telephone hard link, like to what? Anyway, whatever. But so a whole bunch of the movie revolves around the availability and reliability of telephones, dial tone, etc. That's one thing that's just bizarre. The idea of that Nokia slider phone appears at least twice, because also there's a guy who's kind of a double agent. Right. And he has one of those too. He throws it in a trash can. It's like
I can't remember the actor's name, but he was in, he played this on The Sopranos first season, and he's in Memento. Yeah. What's that guy's name?
I forget his name, but you look at him and you're like, that's probably the bad guy.
He was in everything in that era. Yeah. There was a 5-year period when he was in a lot of stuff.
One other thing that really jumped out at me was also the way that they depicted the Matrix as code. Was green phosphors on a black screen.
Right.
Okay, so where have we seen green phosphors on a black screen? Everybody who had a terminal, in the early 80s, you would bring that home for your Apple II or whatever. Yeah. That was the early cheapo kind of CRT terminal. And so the idea, and of course, that it's in columns that are going from top to bottom, but it even has phosphor delay, like the way that they're displaying it. And that's sort of fascinating. The other thing that jumps out early on is the use of physical media. So Neo is like a dealer of programs, and I think they're on mini disc. I think he's giving people Sony mini discs. Yeah. Out of a book, like a fake book that's like Simulacra or something. He opens this book, and it's got these some sort of mini disc-esque thing. So the fact that he is literally handing over physical media in exchange for cash is another kind of anachronistic idea.
Because they're making the analogy there. It's meant to read as sort of like a drug deal.
Right.
Like he's giving you illicit goods as if he's a drug dealer. Right, yes.
Well, and today, if that were depicted, then you would have an upload like a progress bar, right? Like you'd say, okay, wire me the money, and that's one progress bar. Okay, I'm wiring you the program as another progress bar because, it's all in the cloud, right? So there is no cloud, which is, I can't fault the filmmakers for not, foreseeing everything, but that's just fascinating that the prevalence of things like floppies and CD-ROMs and stuff was still so top of mind that they would think, of course, you'd have a program with the word jujitsu handwritten on it that you would put into a slot, and the slot would ingest into a computer, and then that would jack into somebody's cerebral cortex.
But also that's the sexiness of it at the time.
Right, the physicality of it, right? Because you want to be jacking in let's do the other martial arts. Let's just go through all of them.
Right.
And because one of the behaviors of being a hacker or being like a computer nerd was that you would have a lot of media. You'd have a lot of media that you'd collected or stolen or bought or whatever, and you'd have like weird labels, and you'd have it all organized or not. And so that was a point of pride, and you can just tell that the makers of the film are those people.
Okay, you've hit on an excellent point, I think, because this is a super aside. I don't want to get into it, but if you haven't watched Mr. Robot, watch Mr. Robot. It's not perfect, but it is the best representation of hacker culture, of basically computing I've ever seen. But it's not perfect. Don't get me wrong. But one of the things that the Matrix represents to me is, and one of the things that I hate about the depiction of computer culture, hacker culture especially, is always like, well, if you're a hacker, you've got superpowers, man. And in a way, even Mr. Robot is guilty of this, but you've got superpowers that mere mortals can't even begin to understand. And in a way, like the Matrix, the reason it's the perfect hacker / internet era movie or whatever is that they take that idea and they make it manifest in a very real way, because, okay, the entire, all of our reality is just a computer simulation. And so what does Neo do? He gains superpowers because he gains awareness of his reality, and so he can hack it. Not because he's a superhero, but because as a hacker, he can literally, stop bullets in midair and things like that. So in a way, the main reason that I would argue that this is the best computing, hacking, internet, whatever movie is just that it makes it manifest this idea that mastering machines gives you superpowers. And I hate the way that this is usually, especially in mass media, anytime on 60 Minutes or whatever they do a thing about hacking or whatever, I am throwing things at the TV, because you just have to have a basic knowledge of computing to have Leslie Stahl on the screen being like, they can do that, oh my stars, clutch pearls. Like, okay, listen. But
Clutch Pearls should be her slogan.
Maybe we should make that the title of this
of
this episode. But that's definitely her slogan. But so in the Joseph Campbell way of storytelling, that's why The Matrix is perfect. Okay. Now I'm if you had more thoughts, I don't want to interrupt you, but I have a lot of thoughts about this too.
Go with your thoughts, and if I still have one thought at the end, I'll throw it in.
First of all, number one, the visual palette of that movie, it's in the exact same era of Fincher's Seven and Fight Club. That was for a period of time the cool visual palette of everything. Advertising, movies. It wasn't, in fact, I would say that it got upended by Apple's iPod campaign, turning everything white and cleaner. But that's sort of, it's not sepia. I don't know what it is. It's a little bit.
It's cross-processed. I'm pretty sure. So I'm pretty sure they're taking this film and processing to make it greener.
Right.
And that's what the kind of the Matrix world, like kind of the initial part of the movie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So rewatching that now, that strikes me. It's so of its time. And it is of its time. We just got done saying how 1998, 1999 was like, man, everything's possible. But then again, remember, this is a Generation X, that also was brought up on cyberpunk, that was brought up on dystopian science fiction. So this was, Star Wars is literally a fucking space opera that, good guy. So this was the sort of science fiction that we deserved, that our generation deserved in 1999, so that it felt real. It felt like, yeah, man, the web is transforming everything, man. We're living these virtual worlds and stuff like that. But it was totally colored by how we were brought up to expect not rocket packs, or flying cars, but to expect a dystopian hellscape. So that's my second overriding thought. But my main overriding thought about The Matrix is, first of all, and I'm not saying that I'm an expert or anything, but I was a film major. I technically an English degree with a screenwriting concentration. So I went to school to think about these things. I maintain that as a story, the first Matrix movie is perfect, in the sense that you create a set of rules for a universe, and you don't break those rules, and you pay them off, right? And the Matrix is so sad as a series because the logic, the internal logic of that first Matrix movie, there's not a foul beat in there. There's almost no extraneous scenes. Everything serves the internal logic that the screenplay set up, that the story set up. And the way they went off the rails was absurd to me. All you got to do, if you want to do a trilogy based off that first movie, okay, get the humans out of the Matrix. That's it.
Right.
That's all you had to do.
Open the pods.
It would, and listen, you can introduce complications into that. You can do it as a trilogy, but that's all you had to do, man. And again, I'm not saying I'm a screenwriting genius, but man, they really dropped the ball on that because literally all they had to do was get the humans out of the Matrix, and they turned it into something. And I was looking at one more thing, and then I'll let you. I was looking at the chronology of this on IMDb. So 1999, The Matrix comes out. That's the same year that the first Star Wars prequel comes out, right? Mm-hmm. And so, listen, believe me, this is another thing. I was there. A lot of people at the time did not admit at the beginning that the Star Wars prequels were bad because I was in bitter fights with people that I was like, open your eyes. This is fucking bullshit. But but there was also people like me that could see from day one that the Star Wars prequels were bad. And so The Matrix was like this crazy promise of, okay, this is great sci-fi, great movie making, and this can be done right. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so pissed that the Matrix trilogy sucks. And then, but then, the Star Wars prequels suck for a similarly simple way. All you had to do to make the Star Wars prequels good, love triangle. Because all you got to do is, I don't know who screws over who, but clearly Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker both fall in love with the same girl. I don't know who is, maybe they were married, someone was married and then they end up fathering Luke and Leia by the other person or whatever. But all you had to do was a love triangle, and then all those sort of knowing looks from Ben Kenobi in Star Wars: A New Hope would make so much sense. That's Darth Vader's complete motivation. He loved this woman, but whatever it was, simple love triangle. Same thing with the Matrix, man. All you had to do, just get the humans out of the Matrix. That's it. Yeah.
It's my memory of the other movies is almost nil. Right.
There's some cool things in the other. There's some cool scenes. There's some cool characters. But they are as narratively incoherent as the Star Wars prequels.
Yeah. Well, it's like my recollection was it was a lot of set pieces. It's like, okay, let's have a 27-minute slow-mo fight now or whatever. Because we can. Because bullet time was a cool thing. Even though the bullet time in the actual original movie is maybe 30 seconds or something. It's so sparingly done that when it happens, it's a big deal. And then it's sort of, I don't know. There's a thing to be said for restraint in special effects, I guess.
Well, but I'm also making the argument there's an argument to be made for restraint in your storytelling.
In the plot.
Right, because they went crazy metaphysical. They went literally, I am an undergraduate philosophy major, And again, they didn't need to. And I don't know, maybe it was hubris. Maybe they believed that their own press, that they're these filmmaking geniuses. But it wasn't necessary.
Yeah.
Like, even if, again, I would say that some of the ideas that they think of, because maybe what they were thinking is, we are talking about computing, we are talking about the future, so we're going to go crazy philosophical about this and try to examine what the real relationship of identity and consciousness is and stuff. And, all I can tell you is clearly they were not qualified to do that. And also, just get the humans out of the Matrix.
Yeah. Well, you can make your own fan film, I'm sure.
Listen, they reboot things all the time, and clearly, you can make an argument for the Tim Burton Batmans, but they're a completely different thing than the most recent Batmans, and the coming up Batman looks horrible. Batman versus whatever. I really hope that there's a day when Disney will say, listen, we're going to throw out of the canon the prequels for Star Wars.
Yeah.
And that someone will come along of a completely different generation, maybe 10 years from now, and be like, listen to me on this podcast. The first Matrix is perfect. Just continue with the narrative logic of the first Matrix and make a good movie and reboot it that way. It's that simple.
I have one more thought.
Okay.
I think it's related to what you've already said. It's not plot related, really. But I do think, to me, the biggest underlying reason that The Matrix was so fascinating, aside from it looked cool and it, spoke to what I wanted to, how I wanted to be. I wanted to be like a hacker guy and stuff, is that it is literally a tale of cyberspace made real. Like we had this idea of cyberspace, of another space within computers, and a life that involved living kind of inside and among and aided by computers all the time, but yet still relying on people. And this is a very literal approach to that. Like, okay, yep, we're all living in a computer right now and some other stuff, and everybody wears cool trench coats and leather for some reason or whatever. And I think that the approach to just saying cyberspace is real and here's what it looks like was so exciting.
Yeah, it was.
And,
yeah,
right.
it was.
And so because if you go to like from the early 90s, the very beginning of the decade, to have effects like Jurassic Park, where you sort of start to realize, oh, wow, computer effects in movies are getting really good, to like Toy Story in the middle, where you're like, they're really getting quite good, to The Matrix, and then into the rest of it, you start to realize that pretty soon virtual reality or something like that, something visually immersive, has to be coming soon. And to think that you were living in a simulation feels really realistic, really possible, right? Tantalizingly possible.
It's weird because it feels I think you're 100% right in that, like, that's the exciting, tantalizing thing about it. But you know what's weird about that, about making cybernetic living real, is doesn't it feel like a little dangerous and sexy? Like, that's the thing about it, is that if you believe in this whole cyberpunk thing, and our dystopian futures, but like that's what cyberpunk is it feels sexy. Yeah,
no, it really does. And even though the term cyberpunk is actually really quite old by the time this movie comes out, right? We're finally seeing it realized. Like, we have people who look kind of like punks,
right? Because Neuromancer, isn't that like 1984, I think?
Yeah, it's early 80s, 82, 80, something like that. Yeah.
William Gibson's novel Neuromancer starts the cyberpunk movement, if anyone wants to Google or Wikipedia that. Go on. Yeah.
Anyway, I felt like that it again speaks to, like, a generation having kind of an anxiety. And I'm a little bit obsessed with generations who are into apocalypse. And so we had all these apocalyptic movies. And by the way, right before I watched The Matrix last night, I rewatched for the umpteenth time Blade Runner. And so a weird double feature, to be sure, but also Blade Runner, a movie with green phosphorus, on screens. It's always raining. It's always dark. Some parallels there. Probably a better made movie in a lot of ways, but kind of like I feel like these things are all talking in the same space. You've got these movies like Terminator, and anyway, it's basically like, watch out, because we're going to make AI, and that's going to be a problem, right? So, like, having just watched, the thing with replicants and stuff, and then seeing this notion that, like, it's not quite the same thing, but it's a similar idea that the world is now pretty much ruined, really deeply. I think that's another kind of some people, and I'm probably one of them, have this tendency to think that post-apocalyptic stuff is fascinating and kind of titillating, but also the idea that you can kind of thrive during that is part of what's so sexy, because you're literally the last couple of people on Earth who are kind of free,
and you're sort of saving your humanity from being subsumed into this Borg-like something.
And by the way, the odd illogic of farming humans for food doesn't really hold up, but it does. It makes just enough sense to say, okay, sure, okay, just giant towers of people in pods. That's probably, like, if you don't have photosynthesis, I guess that's fine. But I turned to my wife and said, like, wouldn't they just use, like, geothermal? Like, there's other easier ways to get electricity. But,
I suppose.
Well, whatever.
And also, if the computers are this advanced, I mean, they can clearly put satellites up that can harvest.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
anyway.
This is final thought, because I need to go, actually. But you made me think of this, too. This is always my argument about how computers becoming conscious is misrepresented in movies and books and things like that. And I understand why they do it in movies, but you always see that a robot gains consciousness, right? But in reality, it's not going to be a robot. It's going to be these mesh. It's going to be the cloud that becomes conscious. And so Terminator 2 got it right. Or Terminator and Terminator 2. Right. It's Skynet. It's Skynet becomes self-aware, you know. That is how computers will be. It's not going to be some cute robot or some sexy robot like that recent movie that I very much enjoyed. The name is
Ex Machina.
Ex Machina, yeah. But it's not going to be one machine. It's not going to be one data. The way that computers will become self-aware is because it'll be the network that becomes self-aware. It'll be all of our computers. You know, it'll be a neural net becoming real, essentially.
Yeah, your phone will turn against you, and all phones.
Yes, and your car, and yes. And that makes me think of, have you ever seen that there's Stephen King's only movie that he directed? Again, I don't know the name. I'll put it in the show notes. But is
this like Death Race or something?
Yeah. Well,
is it a truck? What is one of these truck
anything that is
movies?
Anything that is a machine becomes self-aware and starts to kill human beings, right? And so the human being, cars are trying to kill people. Yeah. And so it's funny that actually now that is a true potential dystopia, is that our driverless cars and our cell phones and our internet-aware refrigerators will eventually become self-aware and kill us all. And that is how we should end this episode.
You know what? Kids these days don't even know how to drive an automatic. God.
Well, listen, I don't know how to drive an automatic, and I never want to know. Chris, I want to know, is there anything that you're working on right now that you would like to tell us about? Any of the films or anything coming up? What do you want to tell us about?
I have a call for action in case anybody else out there wants to participate. I am making a film on accessibility in the web, about how people with disabilities or different abilities use the web using assistive technologies. And I've interviewed people with visual disabilities, and I would like to get an interview with somebody who is using a Switch or some other sort of physical device like that. So at the moment, I'm looking for interviewees, ideally in the Pacific Northwest, although I will be in Denver for Accessing Higher Ground, showing a rough cut in November. I'm looking for people who want to talk about being on the web and either designing for accessibility or using the web, effectively with assistive technology or whatever you do to make it work. And I've got something like 8 people who I've already talked to, but I'm looking for people who can show us different modalities of accessible technology, assistive technology.
And to get in touch with you would be find you on Twitter.
Yeah, Twitter at Chris Higgins, ChrisHiggins. I am verified, which is super cool. Did not deserve that, but it happened. Or my website, chrishiggins.com. There's a contact form there. It's not super usable, but it gets to me. And other than that, I'm on Instagram as Instablah, and I post a lot of cat pictures and stuff.
You're still writing for Mental Floss?
Yep, I'm doing a lot of Mental Floss stuff on the weekends these days, and that's where my primary output right now is Mental Floss and secret documentaries that you'll find out about early next year.
I can't wait. Well, Chris, thank you, and until next time.
Thank you, Brian.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes, because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.